Way. Pull.
There's like a little
Little tab.
Yeah.
Yeah. There you go.
Hand strength for this.
Yeah, there you go.
Ooh.
Open halfway and let it slam shut.
Okay.
All right, you've now reseated it.
Okay.
Just in case maybe it was misaligned. Fire, fire, recock, fire. If that doesn't work, the next thing to do is you have to debate whether or not you're going to pull the round out because of what is called a hang fire. And a hang fire is when you pull the trigger, you like those Wile E. Coyote cartoons.
It's like jammed.
Yeah, well, it's not jammed. It just didn't work as advertised. The powder is burning. There is fire in there, but for some reason it hasn't detonated. So this is where Wile E. Coyote wonders why the bomb didn't work. He looks into it and then it goes off.
Yeah, I thought I wasn't gonna like where you're going with this.
Yeah. So you have to decide whether or not it is worth the risk to pull out the round with a hang fire and rotate it 180 degrees. So to do that, you would open the breech block all the way, rotate it 180 degrees, and then put the round back in again. Now, if that doesn't work, you have a dead round. So let's assume you have a dead round, or for some reason, such as here, because we're not firing full charge rounds. You fire the round and the ejection does not happen. It doesn't come all the way out. It is your job now to extract the round and replace it with a new one. It's easy. Use a breech opening handle, push it all the way out until it locks in place.
Okay, so this is worth the risk.
Yes. Let us assume we just fired this round.
Okay.
It just did not recoil all the way. Keep going. You're a third of the way there.
Oh, 2x4 down. Yeah. Wow. Oh my gosh, my head's right over here. I'm in the basket. It's almost there. Is it there? No, it's not. This is hard work. Ow. Chiefin, can you give me a hand? Pull the rest of the way. Okay. Fogging up. Whew. All right, but we did it.
All right, now you got to get the round out.
Okay, now I gotta get the round out. Do I need that?
So I would probably use this little pry bar.
Okay.
Just to get that first inch. If your fingers can't grab hold of that rim and pull it out right now, go ahead and use a pry bar. But try just your fingers first.
Okay, I won't lose them.
As long as you don't push forward, you will not.
Okay. Oh God. What a rush.
There you go.
I did it. Look at that. Okay. Now what? Now, do I put it? Wait, was I rotating it?
No, we'll assume this is fired. So this now you chuck it out the hatch and yeah.
For safety purposes, I will not be chucking it
Out of the hatch.
Yeah. I'm gonna put it down very gently over here.
So other things you might do, if you look to your front, you're going to see a mounting point for the machine gun. So
yes.
No, that's the sight.
Oh, this is the sight. Where's
Not the
the
sight, that's an observation.
Oh,
So
this is where the machine gun would
the
be?
machine gun will go here.
Okay.
And your job will be to feed the machine gun as well. So
Okay.
if for some reason you might end up on one of these things in a reenactment, your job will be not only to service the 76, but also the coaxial machine gun.
Okay.
And you look at the top and you see whether or not there's anybody shooting at you. So,
Anyone out there?
so there you go. You're a little bit overtasked.
Okay, I'm a good multitasker.
Great. So that is basically the functions of loading. Feel better?
I'm sweating. I feel great. This is fun.
It's a different workout. If you want to have an interesting and enjoyable workout that's a bit different from CrossFit or something stupid like that.
It's definitely an adrenaline pumping workout. Thank you so much for showing me how to load.
Not at all. You want to risk your fingers again?
No, I'm ready to start gunning.
Okay, gunning it is.
Pew, 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 pew. Spotted. Identified. Fire. Tune in next week for a lesson in gunning. Subscribe below.
The history of the Israeli army is something of an armor enthusiast's dream. They seem to have used pretty much everything from everywhere, to include captured equipment pressed into service. Their willingness to use whatever they can is probably best typified by the service careers of the M4 Sherman, which saw many upgrades over the course of their lives. Now, this particular M50 is one with which I am well familiar from its time at the MVTF in California. It can now be found under the care of the staff at Battlefield Vegas, who have been nice enough to allow me to clamber over it for a little bit in the cool weather of early July in southern Nevada. This is going to be a long intro because nothing about Israeli Shermans is simple. Famously, of course, they started off with scrounging Shermans and guns from wherever they could, scrapyards, reserve pools, and so on, in order to survive the War of Independence. But by 1951, they were in a position to take a slightly more standardized approach to things. So a Captain Hillel Munin was sent to France to do some bulk shopping. The French, of course, were well equipped with a wide variety of Shermans which were procured during and after the war, and they were more than willing to sell a batch of 75mm tanks, which by this point were somewhat beyond their use-by date by Western European standards. The Israelis weren't picky. The French had their own Sherman problem at the time as well. They had a wide variety of Sherman types from a wide variety of sources, and they were something of a logistical nightmare. They decided that they wanted to standardize everything on one engine type. Since they had more Continentals than anything else, they decided that all the other Shermans that they had would be re-engined with the R975. So they opened them up, took out whatever the old engine was, modified the engine deck, dropped the Continental radial in, and they redesignated these vehicles as a Transformé, which basically had a little T at the end of it. So you had an M4A2T, an M4A3T. So it's an A2 or an A3 in American service. It's the engine is the difference. In French service, they all have a Continental. When these were shipped off to Israel, by this point, they're all such a hodgepodge, they defy conventional nomenclature. The Israelis simply called it the M3, after the 75mm gun M3 with which they were all armed. Pretty soon, though, it was obvious that some upgunning would be required, so back to France they went again for more shopping, France being one of the few countries willing to openly sell arms to Israel at the time. 2 purchases were made. One was for a batch of 76mm armed tanks. These were known in Israeli service as the M1. Again, it's the 76mm gun M1. Or it was the M1 Super Sherman if it had the horizontal volume suspension system. The other purchase they made, though, was for a new tank entirely, and this turned out to be the AMX-13 with the 75mm gun. Now, the Israelis very much liked the gun, but they were a little bit ambivalent about the tank upon which it was to be found. So a small order of AMX-13s was placed, and in the meantime, they set about doing experiments to see could you fit this AMX gun into the M3 Sherman turret. It turned out that yes, you could. And so a conversion program was started. About 25 of these tanks were delivered to Israel in time for the 1956 war. In keeping with the trend, again, they were named after the gun which was mounted on the Sherman, in this case, the M50. The Israelis weren't done yet, though. By the early 1960s, Continentals were starting to get a bit long in the tooth and troublesome. So another upgrade program was started, this time to the hulls. The engines were replaced by a Cummins diesel. If the tank still had the vertical volume suspension, it was replaced with horizontal volume. New fuel tanks were installed, new electrical system, and so on. The entire rebuild process basically stripped the hull all the way down to bare bones. When the Israelis were starting to put these things back together, though, they weren't really all that pushed about putting the same pieces back onto the same tanks that they came off of in the first place. It was just whatever was handy on the assembly line. So you could end up maybe with a late production hull, with a mid-production turret, with a 3-piece differential housing and horizontal volume suspension. There's really no such thing as a standard M50, and this vehicle is no exception. So I'm going to get into some of the quirks as we go around it. So that was the long introduction complete. Now it's time to look at the tank. So what we have here is a small hatch Sherman, complete with additional armor plate in front of the bulges for the driver and bog, because of course those bulges are nearly vertical and it's a little bit of a weak spot. I do note how the mounting point for the canvas, the dust shield, does actually merge onto the new replacement plate. The armor plate itself is the old 2 inches, sloped at 58, and then we come down to the differential housing. As you can see, this is a late production differential housing, the shark nose, but the vehicle itself was originally built with a 3-piece differential housing, and I'll explain later how we know this. Another thing I will explain later is this 016, which further complicates this vehicle's history. Other items, so what we have here is a mounting point for the tow cable. So what will normally happen is the tow cable would be stretched front to rear with one end mounted in here and the other end mounted aft. These 2 attachment points here are being used in the traditional manner. You'll see a lot of photographs of M50s with, in fairness, a bit more concertina wire than here, but hey, safety, we're not in wartime. And you simply drape the concertina wire and you clip it into place. Here. Otherwise, it's pretty much a standard Sherman. So your lights are behind the bush guards. There was a replacement siren mounted here. So not the World War II siren, there's a later one in a sort of a tunnel shroud. It has since been deleted. Your standard towing shackle mounts at the bottom of the differential housing also can be used for lifting said differential housing, of course, because you simply undo the bolts here. And that's it. It's pretty much a standard Sherman. And of course, on the turret front, you're going to see the other really noticeable difference from the front, which of course is the gun and mounting. Now remember, this is an original small 75mm turret, and they're sticking a not unsizable gun into it. So in order to avoid ending up with like Firefly levels of crampedness, what the Israelis did was they added a protruding mantlet. Actually, the French did because it was developed in France. The original vehicle that was used for the test project is still in Seymour, although it has been converted back to the earlier configuration. Anyway, back to the mantlet. I do this sometimes, I go off on tangents. What looks like an additional cast mounting isn't actually welded onto the turret front or anything like that. It's bolted on in exactly the same manner as the original mantlet would have been. You just can't see it behind the weather striping. But the end result of it, you can see the pivot point is nearly a foot in front of where it would be on a regular M3 Sherman. As we come around to the side of the tank, this is how we can tell that it was originally built with a 3-piece differential housing. Look at the gap between the road wheels, between the bogies on the HVSS system. This marks the hull as having been built as an M4A4, the extended version with the Chrysler multibank engine. All M4A4s were built with the 3-piece housing. This means then that this particular tank has started with the Chrysler engine, moved to the Continental engine, and now has the Cummins engine, as well as having had the suspension units replaced from VVSS to HVSS. Since the suspension is wider, they added additional sand shields, which are wider, and that also provides opportunity for a little bit of stowage on the side. So we got 3 jerry cans, set of track blocks, sponson box here. This is the exhaust for the auxiliary generator, 2 road wheels at the back. Now, if you look up, you're going to see the French-designed smoke dischargers or smoke grenade launchers, and further back is the counterweight that was added to balance out the length of the gun on the front. Now, all the M50s were made from different size or different types of Sherman turrets. So you had a high bustle turret or a low bustle turret, didn't matter, the process was the same. You cut off most of the bustle, you leave a little shelf at the bottom, provides a little support, and then you add the counterweight on top of that. So this particular vehicle was a high bustle turret. So as the first of the HVSS Shermans that we've come to, now is a good time to take a little look at the suspension.
The HVSS bogies are bolted onto the side just like the predecessors were, which probably made the upgrade process a lot easier. The primary difference, of course, between the suspension types is the volute springs. These 2 things here are now mounted 90 degrees off from previously the horizontal instead of vertical, which is not really surprising given the names horizontal and vertical suspension systems. Just above you got a shock absorber and the 2 pairs now of road wheels, because we have wider track, we now have 4 road wheels per bogie instead of the earlier 2.
have a little bit more range of motion, giving you that smoother ride for which the E8 suspension system was famous. Another obvious difference is the return rollers are now bolted directly to the hull sides instead of being mounted as part of the bogie, where the return roller and skid would otherwise go. You see instead here now is the shock absorber. An interesting little feature just pointed out to me is on the bottom of the hull, right in the corner where it meets the floor, behind the inside wheels, they have shaved out a little bit of the hull armor. And the reason they did this was just to make it a little bit easier to change the inside road wheel when you need to. So it gives you just that little bit more room as you're pulling it off the hub. The track is the late type, of course, 23 inches wide, 6-inch pitch, typical construction with end connectors, wedge bolts, occasional cooling tubes. If you see a hole, that's because it's a cooling tube. There are 83 blocks per side. Now this is the long haul version. If it was a shorter hull, let's say it was originally based off of an M4A3 or an M4A1, you'd be looking at 79 blocks per side. Israeli Shermans generally came with steel cleat tracks. This is obviously a rubber chevron track, and well, this is a post-war thing usually for collectors and so on. It just makes life a lot easier when you're driving on the roads and the Department of Transportation doesn't come after you. The rear hull is something that would be interesting if it wasn't for the fact that a large exhaust deflector is located here. Now the real exhaust deflector is a hinge to allow you extra access to whatever you need to, but they're a little bit hard to come by these days for restoration, so this is a fixed one in place and requires lots of unbolting, and I'm not going to ask the lads here to do this in the middle of July. If you were to look behind, and hopefully we'll have an inset of this particular vehicle before the exhaust deflector was added, you're going to see the swing doors from the original engine access for the Continental, complete with a little hole for the hand crank. On the left-hand side will be a blanked off circular panel about yay big, and that was the original location of the exhaust for the Cummins. Track tension is done in the typical Sherman track tension manner. I've done it in other Sherman videos. If you really are all that interested, and don't blame me for it, but if you are, go find one of the other Sherman videos I've done and you can have a look at the track tension system there. If you look under the hull, you can also see the support. So the bogie on the side is bolted to the side. It's also a little underfloor support as well, just to help take the weight of the vehicle. Otherwise, it's basically stowage. Israelis love putting stowage on their vehicles. I'm perfectly happy with this because I firmly believe that your own gear is better on your own tank. Yes, it can be a problem if somebody machine guns your tank, and that means that it machine guns your gear. But on the other hand, you're not wondering, oh, where is First Sergeant with my sleeping bag? And it just makes life so much simpler. So that's it for the back. Next up is the engine deck. The engine deck, of course, is a complete reconfiguration. So if you recall, your typical Continental engine deck has a long panel just behind the turret with an angled air vent on it and raised barriers around the outside. Well, of course, once they replaced the Continental with the Cummins, the internal configuration is completely different and this panel no longer works. So all they did was they took that long panel, cut it right down the middle, took the two halves and rotated them 90 degrees. So what you're looking at here are the original, basically M4A1 type engine deck cover. But because it's a slightly different shape, wasn't a perfect rectangle as it were, they've had to add a 4-inch spacer here just to fill in the gap. Other items on the engine deck. On the far corner, you're going to see the other latching point for the tow cable. And you'll only see the M50s in Israeli service with one tow cable per vehicle, which may be a little bit odd because usually these days we're used to two. But if you think about it, it's not really necessary to have two, because all that happens is if you're recovering a tank with another tank by tow cable, you already have two tanks there and each one has one tow cable. So you have two tow cables available to tow your tank. Very simple. Gun travel lock is obviously located here. Big one that they had to move because of the length of the gun. Otherwise, the original travel lock, of course, on the Sherman was on the front. The exhaust was relocated in the 70s from that earlier position down below to up here. The Israelis love welding numbers and lettering or whatever onto things just in case paint scrapes off. So on a lot of the fuel ports, for example, you see Hebrew lettering. This one doesn't behind me, but the one over there may have. And it just says what is underneath to keep it simple for the fuelers or whoever's putting fluids in, to make sure you don't put the wrong fluid into the wrong hatch. Otherwise, underneath here is the VT8460. It's the last of a long lines of coming V8 engines, starting with the V8380, and well, it's basically in the name. So VT8 means it's a V8 turbocharged. 460 is the horsepower. And the only real difference between the 460 and the 430 is a higher pressure system, which also meant, though, that you had huge clouds of smoke coming out of this thing, really obvious, and the reliability probably wasn't what it should have been. So the last thing to do is open up the panel and have a quick look inside. The first thing you're going to see is a very, very large yellow air filter canister. There is one on the other side as well. Then further down below, you're going to see a large yellow engine, and actually a fair bit of space otherwise. This brings us now to an end of part 1. And of course, part 2 is when we go around the various crew positions. It'll come out in a couple of weeks. So in the meantime, while you're waiting, use the link down below if you're not already playing World of Tanks, and it'll give you something to do while you're biting your nails wondering what the inside of the tank looks like. So until then, from Southern Nevada and the lads at Battlefield Vegas, take care, I'll talk to you then. And you'll also notice something, woohoo! All right. Welcome back to the wilds of Southern Nevada, where we're playing around on Battlefield Vegas's M50. This is the part 2. If you missed part 1, just go to the link below and get yourself caught up. Otherwise, onwards. And you can see I'm standing in the loader's hatch. This is a oval loader's hatch. Most of the M50s by now would have had them, although there were some M50s still were built off the line with the older split hatch, if they had a hatch at all. Of course, a lot of the early 75mm turrets had no loader's hatch, and they created a field modification that you can install. It was a kit, basically. But loader's hatch here. Other things on the outside of the turret, well, of course, you got the French-made smoke grenade launchers. If you look at the back, you're going to see the fan housing for the ventilator in the bustle/counterweight, 2 radio antennae. On the front of the turret, your spotlight control from inside, a vane sight, 2 machine guns. The Israelis love giving everybody machine guns. It seems like an M5 half-track with like 6 machine guns scattered around the outside. They don't have many men in Israel. So in order to make up the numbers a little bit, they give everybody a machine gun. Why not? So we can see here, we got a caliber 50 on the pintle front and center in between the TC and the loader. And there is a caliber 30. Actually, it's a 7.62 converted just for the commander. A lot of Israeli vehicles, you will sometimes see another caliber 50 mounted on the gun tube. And there is a mount just forward of the mantlet, but that is not for a caliber 50, that is for a spotlight for fighting at night. So that is basically it for the outside. Now it's time to go in. Once you get in, it's cozy, but definitely sittable. The basket does seem to be a little bit higher than other Shermans I've been in, possibly because of the large amount of underfloor stowage. I'll get back to in a second. Although I do note that they were nice enough to put cushioning inside here for your head. Now, of course, you are supposed to be wearing a helmet at the same time, and the Israelis use all sorts of helmets, from the American World War II style through to, you'll even find some Russian style helmets. I think they were actually made in Czechoslovakia, but they're sort of the ribs made of spongy leather. Not all M3 turrets were built with a pistol port. So if they didn't have a pistol port, one would eventually be added. And yeah, it's called a pistol port. In reality, you'd be using it to float whatever you wanted out there, such as shell casings. Back up. Come around to the left side, you see stowage for your small arms, your personal defense weapon, which of course being in Israel is an Uzi, and there's mounting points scattered around for the crew. Periscope, fully traversable and elevation. Obviously a good thing if you're buttoned up. Dome light to the front, the control point for that spotlight I mentioned earlier. simple toggle switch on and off. There is a handle that you can get. It looks a bit like a 1911 handle. It's old, goes back to World War II basically. And you'll note the power connector comes and connects up into here. Coaxial machine gun. It is a 1919. It has been rechambered to 7.62 NATO, and this was done by the Israelis. There's Israeli Hebrew markings on the side. Solenoid fired. There is a single box of ammunition directly underneath the coaxial, so it kind of goes out, around, and up from the bottom left. Stowage for an additional 2 boxes further down underneath. Actually, I think you get more than 2 boxes. I'm looking at it. Correction, an additional at least 5 boxes. And then we come around to the gun with the travel lock for elevation and the breech opening handle. Massive breech opening handle. Let's bring it up, around, lock it into place. Now remember, this gun was originally designed for operation with an autoloader on the MX-13. The Israelis had to look at it, and they decided though not to go with an autoloader and just keep it a manually loaded gun. Unlike, let's say, the Egyptians, who put the AMX-13 FL-10 turret on top of their Shermans. Ammunition scattered around. Well, depends on where you read it, looks like, because I've seen some books say 62 rounds, 9 on the left, 3 on the basket floor, and 25 on each side under the turret basket. This tank doesn't have that I can see. I see stowage for 5 on the left, nothing on the basket, but it does retain the 2 underfloor ammo bins for 25 rounds apiece. And you can see they're not small ammo storage bins, so 5 across, 5 down on each side. So obviously you get to the one to the far side, you got to spin the turret over the back deck. The ammunition types available were HE, AP, and APCBC. The latter supposedly capable of penetrating about 90 millimeters of armor, sloped to 30 degrees at 1,000 meters. The gun was theoretically capable also of firing heat and sabot. However, I haven't been able to confirm Israeli use of those types of ammunition from this gun. The ammunition is not small. So as you can see, once you pull it out, you have barely enough room to put the projectile behind the breech and to give it a good push in. Now, the recoil guard is huge, but really does not get in your way at all. So kudos to them, they designed that one well. But the gun is capable of being loaded at all elevations. It is very close, but it can be done. Otherwise, it's a semi-automatic system, so you slam the round in the first time. After that, every time you fire, it auto-ejects and you just load on to the next round. The recoil card is big, as you would imagine, but it actually doesn't interfere with the loading process at all. So I got plenty of room for my fist to slam it in. So that's it for the loader side, really. I'll just mention the junction box. Looks very familiar if you're an American AFV crewman. The recoil guard folds out of the way very nicely. You just slide back. One small part folds down, the rest folds forward, out of the way. Gives you a lot of room to wander around inside the back of the turret. So that said, next up, TC side. All right, so come over to the right-hand side of the turret. I've put the recoil guard back up just to simulate the lack of space. And the TC has 2 seats. He has an unbuttoned seat, so he can sit comfortably whilst observing the battlefield. And he has a buttoned up seat, a little bit lower behind and unfortunately removed from the vehicle. Thus, I am not sitting on it. However, I will note that he doesn't actually have a whole hell of a lot of room because I'm sitting on the gunner's seat. The backrest would be here. So you can see his backrest, his seat is here. He only has this much room for the gunner's backrest. You've pretty much got to sort of straddle one leg each side of the gunner. And just be careful with your left leg because the recoil guard doesn't go down sufficiently far to cover it, which is probably a little bit disconcerting. As you start at the back of the turret, I do note a couple of mounting points for flashlights and whatnot. The radios are mounted more or less in the same place as they always have been. The ducting for the ventilator goes to the very far back of the bustle, but you will see that the counterweight is literally a counterweight. It is solid metal and there's not much extra internal volume created by the addition on the back. Intercom set, your J-box, again post-war American style. The cupola. So again, M50s were built with either the older split hatch cupola or the single piece direct vision cupola, the latter of course being far preferred. However, like most late model M50s, we have the single piece cupola, but after the M50s left frontline service and they started being used as fortifications and bunkers basically, the M48s were also entering service to replace the M50s. The Israelis thought those were really, really tall vehicles. Because got a big cupola, armored cupola for the caliber 50 DC. So these became the single piece Sherman hatches around. We have a commander's override for the powered traverse. I suspect, can't confirm, but I suspect from the wiring that this is a control toggle for the spotlight, which is mounted on top of the gun. Other than that, it's a simple enough TC seat. I can't really complain about it other than the fact that there is no legroom, but it will otherwise do the job. So next we move forward to the gunner's place. Gunner's not doing too badly. My legs are a little long, but that's typical for me in an older tank. Certainly it's very fightable for me. So, where to start? I guess we'll start off with the gun itself. Now, it's often stated that the CN7550 is a copy of the Panther's KWK-43. I have found nothing to corroborate this at all. Yes, it's a 75mm gun, so it's a one on the original Sherman. And, there's obviously no correlation there. The chamber size is different. You cannot put German ammunition in the French gun or vice versa. To the reason you can tell, the closest it happened is that the French studied the Panther's gun, maybe got a couple of hints or tips, but otherwise it's an independent development. As you look forward, you're going to see, again, several things here. So for example, the gunner's quadrant here for indirect fire, used in conjunction with the azimuth indicator on the right. You can see the large bolts that I mentioned, which hold the entire gun assembly on, and you can look through and you can see the trunnions well forward on either side of the gun, and you can see the way that the mantlet is configured. There would ordinarily be a telescopic sight here. It has been removed from the vehicle, unfortunately. We don't know why. Curse whoever that was. But you will also note that they have modified the gunner's periscope to have the connecting box go through the original mantlet port to connect to the main gun. So it is also still possible to fire the main and coaxial ammunition by use of the periscope, which has a unity optic on the left-hand side and a small telescope on the right-hand side. So you can head forward, you can fully see with all of the advantages that you get of a periscopic sight, you can observe without being so obvious, unlike a telescopic sight where you have to expose most of your turret in order to see anything. He has a junction box of its own. Once the traverse lock is released, the traverse is conducted either by manual traverse in the traditional manner, or you disengage the clutch and there is a power traverse option by use of the handle down at the bottom. It's an oil gear power traverse system here. And just next to the power traverse control handle, you're going to see the main power box. So there's a big toggle here for turret power. You can also toggle on and off the coaxial machine gun and the vents. Elevation on the left-hand side is again the same sort of control handle with a clutch to select elevation with manual control or power control. However, I see no indication that a stabilizer has been retained. Maybe it was, and it's now no longer in the vehicle. Getting good information on an M50, at least in English, is surprisingly difficult. Other than that, again, more protection for the gunner. And you just need to be careful to remember to leave the PC enough room. But again, he's the gunner. He's going to be leaning forward and to the right. He's going to be leaning into the gunner's periscope. So he's not going to interfere with the PC quite as much as perhaps you might think. Finally, of course, the last thing you do is you fire a round, which you get a couple of choices. So there's a coaxial machine gun button down by your foot. There is an electrical trigger or a... Right, normally that doesn't happen in these things. Might be a good idea to get out of here. Now, I am just skipping right over the bow gunner's position because it's a bow gunner's position. Unlike the Firefly conversions, the Israelis felt no need to dispense with the bow gun in order to allow additional ammunition. Although as I'm looking at it, I see that the ammunition on the right-hand side of the tank is actually stowed with the points facing to the rear, unlike the left-hand side which is facing forward, which actually makes any sense because if you think about it, the loader is rotated 180 degrees in order to access it. However, after a few years, it was decided to cull the bow gunner's position because the Israeli army is somewhat manpower strapped, and it was deemed more efficient that if you took the fifth man from 4 tanks, you could then man a 5th tank. So what's really more important, 5 bow gunners or an entirely new additional tank? So that's why we're not really bothered with the bow gunner's position. You've seen it before. Driver's side, again, this is a small hatch Sherman. You've seen me get out of it at combat speed. It's actually not that bad to get out of. Simple, single, swing over hatch. No difference at all to the Grizzly that we filmed before. Now, they changed the engine, they did not change the transmission. The transmission is still your manual transmission, synchronized except for the first gear, and as I recall, reverse. So quote me on that. Left-hand side, well, you got your control box, master power for the hull, master power for the turret, and the jump start connector should you require a slave start. Left-hand side, we note we do have a spare headlight, and your dashboard, which has been suitably converted for operation with your ammeters, oil pressure, oil temperature, fuel level. Your light switch are the earlier World War II, well, middle World War II type really. The very early ones were fuel or a pull-out. Fuel tank selector for your gauge, so you know which gauge you're looking at. Panel lights as a power outlet. High water temperature, warning lights. There's only 2 warning lights, water temperature and oil pressure. And that's pretty much it. You come down, the seat of course will elevate and depress, whether you're driving head out or head down. As I'm driving head down, the periscope will be directly in front of me. There is an auxiliary periscope mounted directly to the front as well. So vision is not going to be a problem. Footrest on the left hand side, there's a clutch, reasonably light. No brake, of course, because the brakes are the 2 tillers. You pull back the 2 tillers, and there is a foot pedal which locks them in place if you wanted to use them as a parking brake. And of course, on the right-hand side is an accelerator. Alright, so as I said, it's probably best we relocate for the local constabulary, come to find out what that loud noise was. So, to get going, we will turn on the master power to the hull. You see all the dials come to life. We have a low oil pressure light on, no surprise there. Turn on the preheater. Turn on the fuel cutoff. Down start. Give it a bit of a prime. Let's see if that's necessary. Oh, fuel oil pressure is good. So we will ensure we're in neutral. Touchdown. And that's what happens if I push the big red button. Time to get out of here.
Está cerca.
Well, unsurprisingly, driving a Sherman is easy. Although I was a little bit surprised I was unable to get it into 3rd on that slide up, so I can keep it there. Somewhere around 300 M50s were totally converted by the Israelis, but by 1973 they were starting to get a little bit inviolable in the theater. So they started being converted to other roles, such as artillery. Not all of them, though. In the late 70s, about 30 to 50 of these M50s were handed over to an Israeli-backed militia force in Lebanon, the South Lebanon Army. And that explains the 016 mark I mentioned on the bow earlier, because they all had numbers welded to the front. So a fourth army for this vehicle. By the late 80s, though, they were also returned to Israel for future use. Other vehicles saw service as fortification. About 50 were sent to Chile, where they had their 75mm guns removed and replaced by 60mm high-velocity guns. They also had their Cummins engines replaced by Detroit diesels. If you're wondering why we were playing with a live cannon tank, well, that's because it is the business of Battlefield Vegas to have tanks available for people to rent out and shoot live rounds. So if you're ever in the Vegas area, tell them we sent you. Who knows, maybe they'll hook you up with something. So anyway, that's it, your M50. I hope you found it interesting and informative. Take care, and I'll talk to you on the next one. Why is this wind suddenly coming out of nowhere, just as I go?
Greetings all! We are making a little bit of a detour here. As you may know, this vehicle is not in World of Tanks, and to the best of my knowledge, it is not planned to be either. So why, you may ask, is World of Tanks looking at a half-track? Well, it's because this vehicle represents an important and rather underrated part of US armored vehicle history. It's one of the first batches of tank destroyers, and it set the stage for all the TDs which followed. Okay, so a quick recap for the three of you who haven't been paying attention to the story so far. In 1939, the condition of US anti-tank defenses was dire. It was to the point that they were doing experiments of chucking rifles and stones into tracks in the hopes of disabling tanks. Come 1940 though, with the rapid and sudden fall of Poland and France, combined with the German propaganda newsreels of panzers careening across the countryside, this put a new emphasis on the question of how do you stop a massed tank attack? Because obviously the more traditional method of sprinkling the front line with anti-tank guns wasn't cutting the mustard. The solution which it came up with was the tank destroyer force. As originally envisioned by McNair, this would be a group of highly mobile, rapidly moving towed anti-tank guns, but actually the towed thing wasn't so much of a requirement, and the tank destroyer force actually ended up choosing self-propelled mounts. Initial self-propelled mounts mainly focused around wheeled configurations of 37mm guns, although there was an attempt to put a 3-inch gun onto a cleat track, the gun motor carriage T1, later M5, which was a complete waste of time and wasn't going anywhere fast. Also, it was starting to be concluded that perhaps the 37mm gun was not powerful enough for the job. An expedient tank destroyer was required. The solution, proposed in June 1941, was to take some old 75mm guns and mount them onto M3 half-tracks. This became the T12, which eventually developed into the 75mm gun motor carriage M3, and as such formed the heavy platoons of the tank destroyer companies with which the US Army entered ground combat in North Africa. We're at the Museum of the American GI in College Station, Texas, so standing in front of one of, to my knowledge, 3 extant M3s. This one is painted up as Tar Heel, which was an M3 which saw service in Iwo Jima. The Marines used them a little bit longer than the Army's ones being replaced in the tank destroyer role, but the Marines kept them around a little bit as assault guns. Now, if you think of a half-track as an M3 scout car with a long rear end, you won't be far off. Pretty much all the half-tracks had a body with oval head screws with self-locking nuts attached to a frame 1/4 inch thick everywhere except for the windshield visors. The radiator has a closable louver, On the front of all the M3s, you're going to see an unditching roller, and the purpose behind this is if you go into a ditch a little bit too steep, instead of the pointy nose digging into the ground, the unditching roller in theory would allow you to press against the far side and roll up. A lesson the M114 designers probably should have learned. As you move a little bit further over to the side, you're going to come across some tow hooks. Coming onto the pressed steel fenders with headlights behind brush guards, you have 20x7 wheels. They're on leaf springs with dual action shock absorbers. Then you come to the classic accordion type hood, under which you'll find the prime mover, what most people will call the engine. What we have here is a white 160AX. It's a 6-cylinder inline, 386 cubic inches, pumps out 147 horsepower when it red lines at 3,000 RPM. All told, this will haul the 10-ton vehicle along at up to 45 miles an hour. Radiator system, 6 gallons of coolant. But it's a very simple system. I mean, long before the days of electronic controls, if you understand the basics of the internal combustion engine, this can be maintained with simple tools. So as you get to the back of the vehicle, it starts to look a bit more like a tank. Really, you're better off thinking of it just as a truck in which the rear wheel has been stretched out. There's no fancy steering systems like there is on a German half-track. Instead, what you have is the power is transmitted through the sprocket wheel at the front with the single row of teeth, which intermeshes with the metal center guides. Comes over a single bogie per side, each of which has 2 pairs of road wheels on each side of the center line of the bogie with the return roller up top, and they are mounted on the vertical volley suspension springs, as ever popular with the US Army at the time. And at the back, of course, you have your idler wheel through which tension may be applied. Now, because you can't break track, the way you get this endless rubber track off is you jack up the body, you then take a chain which comes over the top here and it lifts the bogie wheels off the ground. You remove the flange of the idler wheel, and the idler wheel is not 2 identical halves bolted together. It's closely, you think about it as a tank sprocket wheel with just this outside ring bolted in place. So that comes off, and then you can pry off the track with pry bars. You pry on the new track with pry bars, put the flange back on, tension the track, lower the bogies, and drop the jack. You're done. So I figured the best way to show you just how similar this is to a truck is to come underneath and show you the gubbins. So if you start at the front with the engine, then you get the transmission, comes back past the clutch to the transfer case, and you can see where the power shaft goes to the front axle. This disc back here, that's your parking brake, comes through the universal joint into a standard truck differential. You can see it's on a beam chassis with all the usual fuel and brake pipes, the exhaust pipe. There's really nothing in here that you won't see underneath a typical truck of the time. Coming around the back, well, it is a converted armored personnel carrier in effect, and it comes with the APC's door. It's a little hard to get into because they've basically raised the floor to make room for all the ammunition stowage, but I guess you can always stand on the pintle to get in. Other than that, stowage boxes left and right. You have a little electrical port here if you're towing a trailer, brake lights, a bucket, and these rather quaint and characterizing canvas mudflats. On the right hand side of the vehicle, there's really nothing that isn't on the left hand side except for the exhaust pipe and the battery box on the assistant driver's running board. They of course did some pretty major reconfiguring of the inside of the vehicle. For starters, the 2 30-gallon fuel tanks have been moved from their earlier location further forward to the back corners. Initially, the M3 was going to have a crew of 4, but they required 5 after a bit of testing. So what they did was they added a fold-down seat, which actually attaches to the back door. So you have to close the back door, and then you can fold down the seat. It rests on the ammunition compartments. Originally, there was going to be a caliber 50 pintle mount located here, but they realized that it just took up room that was required for the ammunition compartments, which are hinged and simply open up easily enough. The lack of anti-aircraft mount wasn't really much of a problem though, because in early tank destroyer organization, they had organic anti-air vehicles as part of the TD units. And so we come to the fun bit, the gun. It's the Model 1897A4. Yes, it is basically the French 75, after which the drink was named. And it is in effect a 19th century weapon. Yes, the tank destroyers went into battle with an older version of the guns that were found on tanks. Now you'll see a lot of people say, oh, the 75 was chosen because it was better at killing infantry than it was at killing tanks. It's complete rubbish. This was basically the best gun that the US could reasonably field on a vehicle at the time. It was good at killing infantry, yes, but it was also pretty good at killing tanks. Ammunition can be fired between AP, APC, or HE. I'd love the HE rounds, 13,800 yards, but the needed loadout would probably be the AP rounds. 59 rounds in total would be carried, of which 19 are under the mount and an additional 40 at the back of the vehicle. The M61 AP round would penetrate about 58mm of armor at 30 degrees at 1,000 yards, and the M72 61mm at the same range, although the difference was 10mm at 500 yards because the round locked them quickly. There is one small difference between an M3 and an M3A1 gun motor carriage, and that is the mount. Originally, the more modern M2A3 mounts were used, such as on this vehicle, but eventually they started to run out and had to use older M2A2s. The way you tell the difference is that the mount is about 3 inches further back and is closer to flush with the back end of the ammunition case. The difference in practice was that you had 3 degrees less compression with the more rearward mount. It goes down to 7 instead of 10. On the other hand, you did get 2 additional degrees of left traverse. So this gun would traverse 19 degrees left, 21 to the right, but on an M3A1 gun motor carriage, you have 21 degrees in each direction. To aim, the gunner, who I have to say doesn't really have a comfortable firing position, but to kind of kneel, has a telescope M33. It has a kind of a grid sight, which is reticled for range of 1,600 yards, and also has mils for estimating range and adding lead. Traverse and elevation are by the 2 simple control handles. Elevation is a little bit counterintuitive. You rotate forward in what would ordinarily
Generador de humo activado. desplegada. Sobrealimentación desactivada. Alimentación activada. Generador de humo activado. Cortina de humo desplegada. Torpedos a babor. El equipo enemigo tiene la ventaja. Problema resuelto, señor. ¡A sus puestos de combate! Vamos a darles su merecido. Buena suerte a todos. Vamos a darles su merecido. Resistan, la ayuda está en camino. Capturen esa zona. Afirmativo. Compañero, necesito tu apoyo. Recibido, me encargaré. Recibido, me encargaré. ¡Retírense ya! Necesito fuego de apoyo. Afirmativo. Necesito información de inteligencia. A todas las unidades, protejan ese objetivo. Generador de humo activado. Cortina de humo desplegada. Hemos detectado un submarino enemigo. equipo enemigo tiene la ventaja. El equipo enemigo tiene la ventaja. ¡A sus puestos de combate! A la espera de instrucciones. Cambio. Necesito información de inteligencia. Vamos a darles su merecido. Dame más las unidades. Solicito fuego de apoyo. Concentren fuego en la nave enemiga. Destructor enemigo detectado. A todas las unidades, protejan ese objetivo. Nuestro equipo tiene la ventaja. Todos a estribor. A todas las unidades, solicitamos apoyo de fuego. Nuestra victoria está cerca. Necesito información de inteligencia. Crucero enemigo detectado. Acorazado enemigo avistado. A todas las unidades, solicitamos apoyo de fuego. A todas las unidades, solicito fuego de cobertura. Afirmativo. A todas las unidades, solicito fuego de apoyo. ¡La batalla comienza! Esperando instrucciones. Destructor enemigo avistado. Crucero enemigo detectado. Acorazado enemigo avistado. Crucero enemigo detectado. Acorazado enemigo detectado. Destructor enemigo detectado. Atención, transmito la posición del objetivo. Concentren fuego en el objetivo indicado. Acorazado enemigo avistado. Atención, transmito la posición del objetivo. Buena partida. Acorazado enemigo avistado. ¡Capturen esa zona! Crucero enemigo detectado. Acorazado enemigo avistado. Crucero enemigo detectado. Acorazado enemigo detectado. A todas las unidades, solicito fuego de apoyo. Atención, transmito la posición del objetivo. Destructor enemigo avistado. Crucero enemigo avistado. Acorazado enemigo detectado. Bien hecho, comandante. Concentren fuego en el objetivo indicado.